Shadow snakes, look, on the ground.
Oh yeah. Watch it go, it's almost gone. Sweet.
Oh yeah, look at that. I can see the hold on a minute.
Oh, are you watching? Yeah.
Oh, look at that. Look at the picture.
It's not even showing us.
It's not going to. You can see the solar flares. Look at use the binoculars here.
Horizon.
Here. So this is just going to be kind of a casual video here because I just experienced a total solar eclipse, and they aren't necessarily extremely rare, but I haven't seen one in my lifetime, and I'm 35 years old. I've sort of seen an annular eclipse when I was in the 5th grade, but we had to watch it on a TV screen, and we weren't allowed to go outside. So I've been waiting for over 20 years to see an eclipse, let alone a total eclipse. I've been waiting for that, and I knew that when I was in the 5th grade, being held hostage inside the classroom, that I wanted to see a total solar eclipse no matter what. Science to me in that grade level was my strong point, and I just connected with it. So, you know, like astronomy and space and all that stuff just kind of sits with me. So when I heard about this eclipse coming at this particular year, or I should say when I was reminded of it, because I knew back then, there was no question what I was going to do. So in this video, I wanted to share my experience with that, and then also give you some tips on how to, what kind of equipment you need to use, or how you should take pictures of the eclipse if you haven't done that before, and if you're going to experience another eclipse at some point. But I took this eclipse as a once-in-a-lifetime thing. I treated it as if I probably won't see another one again. There will be an eclipse coming over this area in 2024, I believe, and we will be in the center of totality where we live here. And I'm taking that as like a bonus to this, because in Cleveland, Ohio, there's a very good chance that it's going to be cloudy on that day, and almost guarantee that no matter where you travel to in Ohio, it's probably going to be cloudy or overcast or something, because the last 2 years, I think consecutively, on April 7th and April 8th, there's been snowstorms all day long. So I'm going to treat that as a bonus to this, you know, as my first experience. And, you know, if I see it, great, but if I don't see it, I'll probably never get a chance to see another one again unless I wanted to go eclipse chasing around the world. But to kind of start out here with my experience with it, we had to travel down to Hopkinsville, Kentucky, and this was planned out 2 years ago. Once I saw exactly where I needed to be, you know, with a map showing the path of totality, I knew exactly where I was going to go. Started planning for that right away. I bought some camera lenses and stuff like that to prepare for this as well. But mostly I was into photography before all this happened, so it's I was already at a good starting point because I already had cameras before this all started. I just added to my collection. So going down there wasn't a big deal. We left very early on both of our travel days, made it there no problem. Getting out of the city was probably the worst experience in traffic in my life. It took us 6 hours to go 35 miles outside of Hopkinsville. And then another 4 hours on top of that, we still had not made it to Cincinnati. It was an hour outside of Cincinnati. And all along the way, we were stopping to look for hotels to stay in because we weren't going to make it home. And I certainly wasn't going to drive through the night. So we ended up stopping at a random location where there was a couple hotels, but they were all booked as all the other ones were because everyone's trying to do the same thing. So we ended up parking in a Walmart parking lot and sleeping in the car for a few hours until the sun came up. And at that point, we finished our travels and went home. But even through all that uncomfortable sleeping conditions, getting less sleep, malnourished, dehydrated, stress, anxiety, because there was a lot of weight on my shoulders for this event. A lot of planning and preparation went into this, a lot of practice, a lot of purchasing of equipment. And leading up to that point, even on that particular day, it was still a stressful situation to try to get into position, get stuff set up, making sure I had everything ready to go, because you only have 2.5 minutes to capture what you've been planning for so long and practicing for. There's a lot of weight on the shoulders for doing that. But in the end of all that, everything worked out because of the preparation that I had taken care of beforehand, and the practicing and watching YouTube videos on people who have experienced eclipses before and taking their advice. One to name, Smarter Every Day, Dustin over on that channel had a video of a person who goes eclipse chasing, talks about his experiences. And he talked about shadow snakes, and I was like, what are shadow snakes? I never heard of that before. So basically on the ground, on something like a white sheet with high contrast, you can see these shadow lines moving about 15-20 seconds before totality. And I had never heard of this before. And thanks to him over on his channel and the other guy who he was talking with, I don't know his name offhand, but all the pointers that he said in there made it possible for me to actually take that into consideration and understand how to capture that. So I got the shadow snakes on the ground with a video camera, as well as some excellent photographs, better photographs than I ever could have imagined that I would have gotten, and then also video of the whole scenery with the wide-angle shot with the GoPro. So in total I had 5 cameras set up, 3 video cameras and 2 photo cameras. So making sure that all that stuff was set up in preparation for this whole thing was a lot to work with, but it all came out. It all worked out really well. So with that said, I want to talk about the camera equipment that I used, and some important factors in this is if you're ever trying to get a picture of something like this, there's not really much of a way to practice taking a picture of an eclipse unless you've taken a picture of one before. There's nothing that can really replicate how the picture needs to come out. You're not going to use auto settings on the camera. Maybe it might work to a sense, but you need to learn how to use your manual controls. You have your ISO, your aperture, and your exposure. Aperture, not so important. ISO is sort of important because you want to have enough sensitivity to where your exposures aren't so long that when stuff is moving in the lens, depending on your focal length, that it's not going to create motion blur just from Earth rotation. So you want to make sure your ISO is not all the way down to like 100 unless you're working with a very fast lens and a full frame DSLR. So probably a good starting point is 400 to 800 ISO. And your exposure levels, that's going to depend on your lens, depending on how much light's coming in there. So what you'd want to do with that is kind of play with it. So the closest thing you can probably take a picture of that's going to replicate what you're going to be doing for the event is the moon. The moon is very similar to the same brightness as an eclipse. It's not quite the same, but it's a good starting point to practice because it moves in the sky. You need to learn how to use your camera tripod and everything to line everything up. Especially if you're using focal lengths of 800 or more, you're going to have to learn how to manipulate that, let the camera settle out before you take a picture, use remote triggers, stuff like that. So if you're doing that, probably one of the most important pieces of equipment you can use to make things a heck of a lot easier for you is a fluid tripod head. Not greased bearing tripod head, a video head with actual fluid cartridges inside of it. That makes things a heck of a lot easier because it's a very, very smooth movement when you're moving to point the camera up or down or side to side. It doesn't stick at all. I did see someone down in Kentucky there who was using a ball head with a very heavy lens and camera, and we're having a very tough time. So if there's anything you learn from using a ball head, it's not to use it with long focal lengths, especially if you're taking some picture of something that's in the sky, because that moves and you've got to constantly readjust. If it wasn't moving and you're taking a picture of a stationary object, a ball head's fine, but for any time you got to constantly readjust your camera, fluid head. And the one I was using is a Manfrotto. There's all different models of it, and they're all going to be about the same. But just get a decent fluid head. That's going to make things a heck of a lot easier, believe me. So I had planned for that. Also, when you're practicing with your camera, in Eclipse, you can't capture what it looks like in person with one picture. The exposure level you need is not a specific one, so you need to bracket your shots. So what I did with mine is I took 7 bracketed shots. So basically it's you start with your starting point, so whatever you have your camera set at, which looks probably about not too bright, not too dark, somewhere in the middle, and then you bracket your shots at 2 stops difference each. So 2, 4, and 6 stops brighter, or 2, 4, and 6 stops darker than what you're taking a picture of. And that way later you can combine those images together, or you can just use them just as individual photos, because as you expose it more, you're going to see much more of those light trails coming around the outside of the moon. As you expose it less, you're going to see less light trails, but you're going to see more solar flares or prominences coming around the edge of the moon from the sun. And you can't capture both at the same time. You can get the midpoint and kind of see both, but if you really want to see a good shot of one or a good shot of the other, you have to bracket your shots. It also makes it a lot easier for the camera to do that automatically, because when you use a camera trigger and just hold it down, the camera's not going to be shaking from you touching it. You don't have to worry about using a delay in your camera, because if you do that, you're wasting time. Every time you take a picture with a delay, you're wasting a time waiting for that to settle out. So camera trigger, push a button, let it instantaneously take 7, 8, 9, 10 shots or whatever. Make sure it's in perfect focus. Use manual focus. You really got to dial in that focus, because at that long of a focal length, it's very, very sensitive. So make sure that focus is set well beforehand, and then also recheck it. Yeah, and there was a couple of shots that I did before totality that somehow my lens became out of focus and I didn't even touch it. And I moved it just probably less than the width of a human hair to get it back into focus. It's that much. So a lot of stuff goes into play when you're dealing with something like this situation. So if you are going to use a DSLR, it is going to be a lot more complicated to use than a point and shoot, like my Canon SX50. That camera I used for the long exposures, and the long exposure was like just a couple of shots, and I got what I wanted to get off that camera, and I was done with it. The rest of the shots I got from my DSLR. But having that extra camera there pointed at the sun at the same time just makes it a lot easier, because you don't got to mess with any settings. You get your one camera set at certain settings, you got your other camera set at other settings, and they're taking simultaneous pictures. So you're getting all those shots within that short time frame that you have. One thing I also did have was 2 batteries set up along with an inverter to run power to my equipment. Even though I didn't necessarily need it, except for the one camera I was using to record the entire 3 hours. It's just to make sure that everything is provided with power, and in the event that something goes wrong with that power, they still have batteries as a backup. You want to cover all the angles to make sure that nothing happens during that time frame, because the last thing you want is something to go wrong. Even the GoPro I was using, I tested beforehand, and the GoPro gets really hot. And over a long period of recording time, the GoPro, the sensor inside, will start to foul up, and then your images will basically disappear, and you get these little purpley lines on the picture, and then that's it. As soon as you cool that camera down, the image sensor cooled down and the picture came back to normal. Maybe it's a defective unit, I don't know. I don't play with the GoPro that much, but what I did for this situation is I put a fan, a little computer fan, right next to it to keep it cool during this entire time, because I did not want that to happen during the total, especially during totalities. And because I did that, I got great video footage from that as well. The camera was capturing shadow snakes on the ground, little contrasting lines that move. That was another camera setup, and I had that camera set up a day before, well, yeah, a day beforehand, because the exposure level that it needs to be to capture that is specific, because 15 seconds before totality, there's a very specific brightness level that there is, and you have to set the camera to expose at only that brightness level. You can't set it to auto exposure. So the way I did that was I listened to Smarter Every Day, Dustin's channel, and he doesn't know me. I'm a subscriber to his channel. I had set it up the way that that was described on there, which is basically about 15 to 20 minutes after sunset, official time, not after you see the sun disappear, but after the sun disappears over the horizon, which is the official time. 15, 20 minutes after that is about the brightness level of when those shadow lines start to appear. So I had the camera set at that particular exposure. I even used, it was a paint sample sheet showing different variations of like gray. It goes from almost white to very, very, very light gray to darker, darker, darker. So I had that set up on the sheet, and then I set the exposure to be able to see all those different variations. And because I did that, I was able to capture those very, very, very faint shadow lines that you see moving across the ground on a white bed sheet that I had set up on the ground. So a lot of preparation, but if you are trying to photograph the eclipse and all those different things about it, learn your equipment, take advice from people who've done it, take advice from professional photographers, and and practice with it. You have to practice. Practicing is good even if it's not for an eclipse. If you're trying to get a picture of something and you really like photography, you really like capturing things, rare things, wildlife, stuff like that, stuff that doesn't wait for you. You have to wait for it. So if you're trying to capture things like that, practice with your camera. Learn how to use the manual controls. That's gonna make the difference between not getting the shot and getting the shot. So understand your equipment too. Understand how it functions. It's a very good practice to get in. Practice makes things perfect. So something like a total eclipse, if you want to do stuff like this, if you want to photograph it, make sure that you know your equipment and how to use it and understand the technology. There was one thing I wanted to kind of describe though, is when the moon is just covering the last little bit of sun, like a very, very small pinpoint of light, or when it's revealing that first pinpoint of light when it's moving away, the sun isn't like yellow like how some people perceive it. What it looks like when that moon is moving away, and just for that moment, it's okay to still be looking at it, just for a short time. It looks like someone is arc welding on the edge of the moon. It is a bright, bright white, maybe bluish hue, if you want to put it that way, pinpoint of light that's about 100,000 times brighter than any other star in the sky. Like, it looks like a pinpoint of light, like a star, but 100,000 times brighter. And it's like someone shining like just a super bright LED flashlight and flickering it around, or a really bright laser in your eye, something like that. That's about what it looks like. It's something you would never see ever. You would never see the sun like that. But it was a very different experience from just viewing the sun every day in your life. Like it was something very, very different that you'd never understand it unless you saw it. Because a video isn't even going to capture it the same way. And it's the same thing with the corona around the sun. You're never going to see it on video or on a picture the same way as you see it in person. It's very different. The light trails are really defined when you're looking up in the sky. They look realistic. It just looks like there's definition to them. So that's about it. I hope that some of you watching this video and at least enjoyed a little bit of my story about it, and hope you enjoy some of the footage that I captured. And I hope for some of you who didn't get to see it, at least get a decent experience, because the pictures you're going to see and the video you're going to see are about as accurate to real life as it can be, as far as the color and the brightness levels and everything. So hope you enjoy, and thanks for watching.